Despite getting the Friday the 13th franchise back in the good graces of hardcore fans and even getting some rare praise from critics, the performance of Jason Lives at the box office was underwhelming. It came in at number 2 at the box office during its opening weekend, the first time in the franchise a new entry failed to open at number 1, and it ended up making less than A New Beginning had, making just $19.5 million. While certainly still profitable, there was no way around it. Jason Voorhees and Friday the 13th's financial power was weakening. What may have been the reason for this? Well, the slasher boom of the early 80s, inspired largely by John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978, was clearly running out of steam by that point. However, a certain dream demon from Elm Street arrived on the scene in 1984, and for the first time there was a legitimate threat to Jason's place as king of the slashers during the 1980s. Freddy Krueger was the new slasher villain on the block, and already had stolen some of the Voorhees thunder. Even in those early days, Paramount saw the potential for a showdown between the legendary slasher icons. Yes, almost 2 decades before it happened, Paramount approached New Line Cinema about trying to make Freddy vs. Jason a reality. Paramount's proposal was that they would control the U.S. rights to the film, with New Line controlling the international rights. New Line didn't go for this, though, and the dream of this crossover was dead, for now. The first director Frank Mancuso Jr. reached out to about a 7th chapter in the franchise was Tom McLaughlin. While McLaughlin didn't have much interest in returning, he did have one idea for the next entry: Jason vs. Cheech and Chong. Mancuso rejected this idea, though, and with that, McLaughlin's time with the franchise was officially over. Mancuso's involvement with the Crystal Lake part of the franchise was also becoming more distant, as he was working on other projects, including Friday the 13th, the series. Because of that, Barbara Sachs was brought on as a new associate producer, answering to Mancuso but being more hands-on with the franchise than he was at that point. Sachs had a different vision for the franchise entirely, apparently stating that she wanted to make a Friday the 13th film that would win an Academy Award. She even had her own concept for Part 7, where a wealthy businessman would come to Crystal Lake looking to build condos, despite warnings from the locals about Jason. The idea was Jaws-like, but it was rejected by Mancuso. Writer Daryl Haney would eventually pitch several concepts for Friday the 13th, with Sachs rejecting them all. So he made one final pitch, a Friday the 13th film where the final girl had telekinetic powers. The idea intrigued Sachs, and with that, Haney was hired to write the film. The job of directing the film was offered to John Carl Buechler. Buechler had experience and was a fan of the horror genre, but he was not a fan of the slasher genre. His first response to his agent when he was told about the offer was, "Why? Haven't they made enough already?" Despite that, he took the job. The production of Part 7, later titled The New Blood, can only be described as incredibly tense and in some areas pretty unpleasant. Part of this had to do with the extremely rushed filmmaking process. The film was cast, filmed, edited, scored, and released all in about 6 months. But the other major reason for this film's rocky production history was simply that several major people working on it did not like each other at all, either professionally or personally. Haney was not impressed with Buechler's previous work, and while intrigued by the Jason vs. Carrie concept, Buechler wasn't thrilled with Haney's initial script. The entire experience with The New Blood was especially sour for Haney, as his script went through 15 different drafts to the point where it wasn't even his vision anymore. When he finally saw the finished film, he hated it. On top of all that, he was not paid the $30,000 he was promised for his work in writing the film. All in all, Haney has never been shy about expressing how he feels about his experience on the film. It was terrible. Buechler and Haney was not the only tense relationship, though. Despite Barbara Sachs hiring Buechler herself, the two absolutely despised each other, with Buechler going as far as to label Sachs a little Hitler. How bad did it get? Well, Sachs took issue with Jason's makeup, saying it made him look like a frog. She ordered unmasked Jason's presence in the film to be scaled back. It was an order that was essentially ignored by Buechler. In response, Sachs altered the ending of the film, with many strongly believing it was done purely out of retaliation and petty spite. We'll get to that later. This even extended the cast, with many recalling that star of the film, Lara Park Lincoln, who played Tina, the Carrie of the story, was difficult to work with and didn't get along easily with other cast and crew, especially with her co-star, Kevin Spurtas. On top of all that, while the MPAA was never a friend to the Friday the 13th franchise to begin with, they were especially hard on The New Blood. The film needed to be submitted a whopping 9 times to receive an R rating, and when it was all said and done, it ended up being the most watered-down entry in the franchise as far as the kills and gore goes. So, as you can tell, the production of The New Blood was extremely troubled. But if you have watched any of my previous coverage of the franchise, you know that we've been there before with Friday the 13th. Now it's time to discuss. How did The New Blood actually turn out? Let's get into it. The first positive thing I can say about this film is that the overall portrayal of Jason is strong. Honestly, I think this is the best look in the franchise for Jason, both masked and unmasked. From his clothes to his mask to even little things like the chain hanging around his neck the entire film, I love how weathered and decayed this Jason looks. The mask being damaged enough to show the side of his face and part of his mouth was a nice touch, and it's a good tease for the unmasked look of Jason we get at the end of the film. Seriously, Barbara Sachs is crazy for thinking that unmasked Jason looks bad in this movie, and in my opinion, we should all be thankful to John Carl Buechler for ignoring her order to cut that portion of the film down. Now, of course, I can't talk about Jason in this movie without mentioning the new man behind the mask, Kane Hodder. Many consider Hodder to be the definitive Jason. While I don't necessarily agree, and I have a few different Jason actors over him, I think he does a solid job here. I also have to give credit to him for his performance at the end of the film. Acting under all that rubber must have been hard, and he does a great job. Overall, Jason is a big strength this movie has going for it. Now let's talk about our final girl in this film. Tina is one of the stronger ones in the franchise. Obviously, her standout trait is the telekinetic ability she has, allowing her to take on Jason directly in combat. While the selling point of this movie is two supernatural entities facing off in a battle of good versus evil, we do spend a decent amount of time before that exploring Tina as a character and how these powers have had a negative traumatic effect on her life. Her journey in this movie is not only about honing her powers, but overcoming the guilt she feels for accidentally killing her father with them at a young age. Lar Park Lincoln gives a very strong performance in this role and captures the portrayal of a teenage girl who's desperately trying to be normal, but is an absolute wreck trying to figure out how to handle the gift she has. Finally, I will say that when we do get the showdown between Jason and Tina, it's excellent. Seeing an adversary actually rough up and take it to Jason is something we don't see very often, as we see him get electrocuted, crushed, burned, and more. The audience came to see Jason finally meet his match, and it does take a while, but when it eventually gets there, the movie delivers in a big way for the most part. However, maybe waiting until the last 15 minutes of the film to get the Jason versus Tina battle we as the audience came to see would have been more tolerable if we were spending time with better characters. Daryl Haney would go on to say that Frank Mancuso Jr. essentially ordered him to follow the template of the final chapter, which Mancuso views as the best film in the franchise. It's easy to spot, as similar to that film, we are following two groups who live right next to each other, with one of them naturally being a group of college kids up at Crystal Lake for a weekend of partying. However, the reason why this template works a lot better in the final chapter is simple. The group of partygoers in that film that are sharing time with our main characters were a lot more fun and likable in that film. I often hear people knock the 2009 reboot for having unlikable characters, but I think it applies much more accurately to the new blood. I know characters like Melissa and Dr. Cruz being unlikable was intentional, but then you have characters like Robin, who betrays and insults her best friend.
Robin, did you see the way David just looked at me? Oh, get real, Maddie. You're not his type. You need a little touch-up work first. Thanks.
And Eddie, the nerd who doesn't hesitate to pull a mean-spirited prank on Tina. The rest of the characters outside of that are largely forgettable. Overall, I'd say the only truly memorable and likable characters in the entire movie are Tina, Miss Shepherd, Tina's mom, and Nick. But even then, while Nick is likable enough, the movie spends a lot more time building up a relationship between him and Tina that, in my opinion, is really lacking in romantic chemistry. So sadly, outside of the ones I singled out, these are some of the worst characters in the franchise. And again, maybe spending time with these characters would be easier to take if the kills were gnarly, but these are by far the worst and most watered-down kills in the franchise, even though that is no fault of the filmmakers. While the MPAA was never a friend to the Friday the 13th franchise in any way, they were notoriously hard on the new blood. Even with the tense relationship with the MPAA, each previous installment had at least 1 to 2 genuinely very good to great kills to hang their hat on. That's not the case with the new blood, though, as the only thing memorable about these kills is how watered down they all are. Which is sad, because if this element of the film alone was better, then I'd be much higher on the movie as a whole. The whole reason the audience is willing to put up with characters as unlikable as Melissa and Dr. Cruz in a slasher film is because we want to see them meet a satisfying end at the hands of Jason. John Carl Buechler would even go on to say that the MPAA castrated his movie, and frankly, he's right on the money there. Also, as much as I hate to say it, for the first time the music takes a big step back in a Friday the 13th movie. While Harry Manfredini's name is on the film, he didn't actually provide any new music for The New Blood. He was too busy with other projects at that point, so the filmmakers just took stuff he had done for other movies in the franchise and put it into this one. It was then that they realized they only had enough material to cover half the movie. That's when another composer was brought in, Fred Mullen, to do the other half. While Tina's theme is pretty good, Mullen's more synth-heavy score doesn't mesh well with Manfredini's classic score, so as far as the soundtrack goes, it feels quite disjointed. Finally, the way Jason gets defeated in this film, with Tina's dad coming out of the lake, is lame. Don't get me wrong, that ending could have worked if Tina's dad had the same zombie effects and makeup that Jason had. And guess what? He was supposed to. So what happened? Barbara Sachs nixed it purely out of spite for her order to scale back Unmasked Jason being ignored. Because her ego got hurt, the movie suffered. Instead, with Tina's dad coming out of the lake looking rather dirty, but the same as the day he went down there, the ending just comes off as a joke. So with all that said, guys, for all that this movie gets right, I can confidently say that this is the first movie in the franchise where my negative feelings outweigh my positive ones. While there's enough genuinely good stuff here that I don't necessarily hate the movie, I view this as the point where the franchise started to go downhill. With unlikable characters, extremely watered-down kills, a disjointed score, and a really lame defeat of Jason, Lara Park Lincoln's performance, Kane Hodder's arrival combined with Jason's excellent look, and the final 15 minutes with Jason versus Tina aren't enough to save this one. I'm going to have to give The New Blood a 4 out of 10, but that's going to do it for me today, guys. What do you think of this chapter in the franchise? I know this review may be somewhat controversial, as The New Blood seems to have some passionate fans. Do you agree with me or do you disagree? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you guys later. Take care.